Welcome to App Stories, a weekly exploration of the world of apps. Today's show is brought to you by Ulysses. I'm John Voorhees, and with me is Federico Viticci. Hi, Federico.
Hey, John. How are you?
I'm doing all right. We've got some really special guests today. I'm really excited about today's show.
Yes.
Well, I want to welcome to the show today two members of Team Alto, the team behind both Alto's Adventure and Alto's Odyssey. We've got Ryan Cash and Harry Nesbitt. Ryan is based in Toronto, Canada, and Harry is in London. Welcome to the show, guys.
Thanks for having us on the show.
We're both really happy and excited to have you on the show today, and we want to make the most of our time together on this episode. So I'm going to dive right in with a question for Harry. So, among many of the people that we know, Alto's Adventure was a particularly rare iOS game. It's a game that became really sticky with a lot of people. It's a game that people revisited over and over time. Because, I look at a lot of games, and then part of that's because of writing at Mac Stories, but a lot of those games end up in a folder or eventually deleted, and maybe I revisit them once in a while, but Alto's Adventure was a game that I've come back to over and over again, and I feel like that's true with a lot of my friends as well. What do you attribute that to?
Yeah, it's always tricky to pinpoint exactly, but I think it's kind of a combination of things. So firstly, there's kind of a variety of ways to approach the game. And we definitely wanted to make sure we were allowing players to kind of approach it in whatever way that they felt was best for them at any particular time. So maybe you want to play for a high score or to compete with friends, or maybe you just want to tune out distractions and just enjoy the scenery for a few minutes. So I think to that end, having a game that has a lot of variety of things to do and see, kind of almost sort of changing sort of passively around you, the world's always in motion. I think that kind of creates the sense that there's always something new to see and experience every time you come back. And also hopefully creates the sense that this is like a real living, breathing environment that players can kind of connect to and feel like they're visiting. And then obviously I think accessibility as well is a big thing. Like we want to make sure that we're not overcomplicating the way that you interact with the game, that it's it's all, so for the most part, one touch input. It's something you can kind of learn quite quickly, but maybe it takes a little while to fully master. So that kind of easy to learn, hard to master approach.
Yeah, and it seems to me like it's a common thread between Alto's Adventure and Alto's Odyssey, which just came out in the last couple of weeks. And it's a thread that I think really helps bring people over to the new game. But what other kind of challenges did you face as you were working on a follow-up to a game, which was, Alto's Adventure was a real big deal and was incredibly popular? What were some of the things you had to balance and deal with as you planned out Alto's Odyssey?
Yeah, definitely trying to preserve that simplicity was kind of key. We want to appeal to existing players and also hopefully appeal to new people as well who've maybe never experienced the first game. So trying to balance the kind of additional stuff with what's already in there, it's quite a challenge, particularly with a game like Alto's Adventure, which we put a lot of effort into making sure was a very kind of pared down experience. We wanted to make sure we're only including the stuff that's absolutely vital to the game that we wanted to make. So then with a sequel, and you're kind of tasked to sort of iterate on that and hopefully add some new exciting things. It almost feels like there isn't room for it, and you have to kind of shuffle some things around and rethink the way that the game delivers that content to hopefully not overwhelm people. Also, similarly, from like an art standpoint, you kind of have to take this existing sort of style that kind of evolved naturally over a period of time. It wasn't that it didn't sort of just come fully formed. It's sort of like you're iterating slowly over the course of development of figuring out what works and what doesn't work, and then having to apply that to a whole new sort of environment. And there's no guarantee that that's going to necessarily work. You have to sort of rethink what the fundamental rules are a little bit and say, okay, how can I sort of take these rules and apply it to a new space? So there's definitely challenges, and hopefully we went some way towards getting that right.
So there's this idea that I keep coming back to whenever I play the Alto games, and that I think is even more true with Odyssey, of balance, of the balance between the environment, the graphics, and the gameplay. You know, that you have this contrast between these beautiful landscapes that you can almost sort of get lost just looking at, and this gameplay that requires you to be attentive, to be focused on making the right jumps or chaining the tricks that are required for an achievement, for example. And also even in Odyssey, I think even more than in Adventure, the balance of introducing new features without overwhelming the player. So you have some new functionalities, but also you don't want to throw them all at once at the player. So you have this slow trickling down approach to introducing new features. And I wanted to ask you, what's the difficulty in balancing things, especially when you're making a sequel or a follow-up to, or a new game in the same universe, if you will? How can you keep track of this balance, and where do you draw the line and say, no, we need to pay more attention, for example, to this mechanic instead of letting the player focus on something else? How do you strike this balance?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely like at the core of the challenge that we face. And I think we just allowed ourselves to experiment with a bunch of different things. So at a certain point in development, quite early on, we sort of had an internal Alto jam where we were sort of just allowed ourselves to try a range of different mechanics to see what would stick. And I think we very quickly realized, or sort of reconfirmed with ourselves, that it's the things that were sort of more accessible, like one-touch input. Any mechanic that required gestures or two hands or any more complicated input sort of methods, just quickly realized that it didn't fit, and it was asking too much of the player, or it was asking them to adjust the things that they maybe have grown used to in the first game. But also, I think trying to sort of separate out those new elements so that you're not throwing them all at the player in one go can be helpful. Like, I think that sort of onboarding experience is very important. We want to hopefully have the player feel like they're sort of being guided through the first 10, 15 minutes of gameplay, and that there's new things that can kind of lead them through and keep them wanting to come back for more. Yeah, I think those first impressions count for a lot. It's definitely a challenge.
Yeah, I think another thing, just to quickly add as well, is that was sort of a big challenge for us, was that we were kind of designing for two audiences in a way. One audience being people who have never played an Alto game and who are experiencing Alto for the first time in Alto's Odyssey, but also people who have played Alto's Adventure and maybe, finished the entire game, or were one of those players who had like a really big high score. So we had to kind of make sure that the game was just as approachable as the first game was, but also kind of not like dull or boring for anyone who, had mastered Alto's Adventure. And so that was sort of one of the things we challenged with a lot as well.
So speaking of Alto's Adventure, since that first game, Snowman has announced a bunch of new projects, even with different developers. And I think on this show, the people who listen to App Stories, I think our listeners are more familiar with the idea of how, for example, a productivity app is made. And I wanted to know, both in terms of Snowman's relationships with other developers, and specifically about Alto's Odyssey, what's the creative process like? How does a game like Alto come together, and how does Snowman work with other developers around the world to make these upcoming games?
Mm-hmm. So I think the first part of it I'll talk about is kind of like the difference between making an app and making a game. And it's almost like they're two entirely different things. They just both happen to be apps that you have on your phone, but the creation process is quite different. So our very first app was Checkmark. And the way that sort of came into being was I was using the iOS 5 reminders app during beta while I was working at Market Circle. And I fell in love with location-based reminders, but in Apple's app, it took 11 different steps to create a location-based reminder. And so it sort of was born out of frustration where I said, wait a minute, I love this feature, but there's got to be a better way to do it. So I kind of went home and I talked to my friend Jordan, who we grew up together, and said, hey, I think I have an idea for an app. Let's get together and see if we can hash this out. So we sort of started sketching and trying to figure out what the UI might look like, and just sort of to try to solve the problem on how we could reduce this number of steps from 11 to something lower than that. And we ended up being able to get it down to 3. And when you're working on an app, I think it's a lot more like logical and matter of fact. So we were trying to solve a problem, and we sketched it out on paper, and we kind of knew we had solved the problem, at least for ourselves, in making something that we thought would do the job better. So, after we had sort of solved the problem on paper, it was a matter of hiring a developer and a designer to help us bring it to life. But from there, I mean, there's still creativity involved in terms of, what should we call it? What should it look like? What sort of should be the branding behind it? But it's a little bit more like, if you're building a house, it's sort of like you have the design for the house figured out and you just have to build it. And of course, things come up along the way, but you're essentially just building the house and doing the construction. Whereas I think when you're making a game, you're kind of trying to figure out what the house should even look like. Maybe it's not even a house. Maybe it's an apartment building, or maybe it's a bunker, or it's a tree house, if that makes any sense. It's kind of totally, in some ways it's easier because there are no limitations. And in a lot of ways it's harder because you kind of have unlimited runway on figuring out what your idea is. And with apps, there's a little bit more competition in the market. So if you use an invoicing app, for example, you're not going to use multiple invoicing apps. You're going to pick the one that works the best for you. And that's sort of the end of the story. Whereas with games, you are competing with other people in terms of like, you want your game to be people's favorite game, but it's really, especially in the indie game scene, it's a much tighter knit community where everyone kind of helps each other out. And I think each new indie game that comes out sort of pushes the genre forward. And, just because you love Alto's Odyssey doesn't mean you're not going to play any other games, and vice versa. So the community is a little bit more friendly and helpful to each other.
That's a great point, actually, of like the freedom of making a game is both the main difference between making an app, but also the main problem in a way, because you can make anything. Mm-hmm. Whereas with a location-based app, for example, there's just so many ways that you can make a reminder. Mm-hmm. But with the designer and the developer, you can imagine anything. So that's an interesting way to put it. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think for me personally, now that I've sort of been out of the productivity or utility app zone for a few years now, to me, I don't know that I would go back. I spent quite a bit of time in that industry, but I feel like with games, you have the opportunity to just sort of think outside the box more and flex your creative muscles. And I kind of enjoy the challenge.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I mean, you really do have a lot more leeway and a lot more room for creativity. One thing that I'm really curious about, and maybe, Harry, this is something for you first of all, which is a lot of times when, I'm working on a writing project or Federico's working on a writing project, a really big meaty project, and we're getting towards the end, we lose all objectivity. And fortunately, we have each other and the other members of our team to kind of tell us whether what we're working on is any good anymore, because we lose sight of, we get to the point where we're sick of a project and we just want it to be done. And I have to assume that there's an element of that in creating a game as well. I mean, is that the case? And I guess, how do you deal with that sort of thing?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a challenge. Like, it's probably one of the hardest things, I think, in making anything, is to have some sense of objectivity about what you're creating. Like, is it any good? I think sometimes the people who are closest to something are the least well-equipped to judge whether it's finished and ready, or if it's actually any good. I mean, we all want our stuff to be the best it can be, and I think to some extent it's that anxiety that makes it, hopefully, ultimately, at least close to what you wanted to make in the first place. But I think the thing that certainly helps with our team dynamic is having people on the project who have a little bit more distance and are able to have a more objective view of the game, who are still very much invested emotionally in whether this thing does well. So you don't have to worry about whether or not they are just trying to, not trying to hurt your feelings by saying they think it's great. Like, you want an honest opinion. But I think that can definitely go a long way. And also showing it to as many people as you can who are impartial. I think Ryan always had a great thing that he called the shower test. I'd let him explain that.
Yeah, the shower test is something that was sort of something I realized in hindsight. And it sort of proved to be really valuable as a kind of like reality check sort of tool. So the shower test is a little bit of a long story, but I'll try and make it as quick as I can. So back in 2012 or early 2013, we were working on our first game, which was called Circles. And at the time, my sister was living in Germany. And, we get along really well. I always keep her in the loop of what we're doing. And so she had come back to Toronto to visit. And it just so happened that we got the first internal build of the game on our devices that day. And so, she came over and I said, hey, we just got a build of Circles and I'd love you to check it out. Here's my iPad, play the game for a little bit. I'm going to have a quick shower. So I hopped in the shower and I came out of the shower 10 minutes later. It wasn't a super long shower or anything. And I went to her and I said, hey, how was Circles? And her response was, oh, it's amazing. It's beautiful. I love it. It's so fun to play. And I said, oh, cool. And I happened to notice that she was playing Cut the Rope when I walked over to ask her about that. And so she passed me the iPad back and I checked the multitasking tray and I kind of had noticed she had played another game. I think it might have been Angry Birds. And she had gone on Safari and logged into Facebook. And I had literally only been in the shower for at the most 15 minutes. And honestly, at the time, I didn't really think anything of it. I thought, she checked out the game, she liked it. And I kind of agreed with her as well. I thought the game was beautiful, charming, it's fun. And so I really didn't think anything of it. Or sorry, in hindsight, after we launched Alto's Adventure, I kind of was able to take a step back and reflect on the last couple of years. And with Alto, it was very different. When people would come over, they would ask to borrow my iPad so that they could play the game. And they would sit there and play it. And if a couple people were over, they would fight over the iPad and say, hey, it's my turn, let me play. And even had situations where my one friend had an internal beta of the game and he was playing and he would message me and say, hey, what's your high score? I want to beat you. And I would beat him and then he would beat me. And we had this whole thing going back and forth. And other friends had found out that some of my friends had access to the beta and they didn't. And they were like actually offended. Maybe they'd played it at our house or something. So in hindsight, the sort of shower test thing for me is if you hand somebody, especially a close family member or a friend who's supposed to maybe even lie and say that they love your game and, not turn it off. If they're not going to play your game for, more than 10 or 15 minutes, then it's just not going to do well in the long run. And with Circles, it was a huge learning experience. And I think we learned a lot about design and building a product. And it's what actually got us into games. But if you don't have a game that people can play for more than 10 minutes, I think you're going to run into trouble. And for me, I think with games, there's sort of, you sort of have two routes you can go. You can either try to, and I don't think you should set out to design with this in mind. I think it's just sort of where you'll end up landing. You either kind of have a game that can be played almost endlessly. It doesn't have to be an endless runner, but a game like Threes is a good example where there's always a reason to come back and play. In some cases, it's a game that is constantly being updated, like Two Dots, or perhaps a game like Alto's Adventure or Odyssey, where even if you've completed all the goals, you can still try to beat your own high score. You can play Zen mode, and there's always something new to see in the scenery. So those are games that you can kind of pick up and play from time to time. And the other sort of game is something like Florence, which was just recently released, where you can play through the entire game in half an hour or 45 minutes, but it's something that sits with you for a long period of time and is something that you kind of is your go-to game that you talk about. It's sort of in the same way as a movie you may only go see in theaters or see it at all only one time, but it's something that you talk about for years to come. So that all kind of relates to the shower test, I think.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really interesting point because I feel that way a lot about like Zach Gage's games too, because Flip Flop Solitaire, for instance, there's something about that game where if you're only doing one suit and you're doing just like, 4 stacks or 5 stacks, whatever it is, and you get a little bored of that, you can always add another suit or you could add another stack. There's a lot of ways to kind of open up the game and make it more challenging and progress through it without getting bored. And you guys definitely passed the shower test because Federico and I, who really couldn't talk about Alto's Odyssey while we were on the beta, we're swapping screenshots of our high scores and trying to beat each other over the last several weeks. So
that's awesome. And I think to sort of add to what Harry said, for me, it's been a bit easier to look at it from maybe a further step back And so when we were in the tail end of working on Alto's Odyssey, I felt really confident about it. And I think it was because I've sort of gained this experience in the last few years. But back when we were building Alto's Adventure for the first time, I would still have those moments of panic and anxiety. I'd be in the shower or something and thinking like, wait a minute, we've been working on this for 2.5 years. What if nobody likes it? And it was a lot more unsettling. But I think because I felt like Alto's Odyssey did a great job at what we wanted to do with a follow-up to the original game, it was a little bit easier for me to feel a little bit at peace with it before we launched. Also, just the fact that I myself couldn't stop playing it, not just for work to catch bugs and things like that, but I thoroughly enjoyed it. So it was a little bit easier this time around for me. But yeah, I totally see where Harry's coming from as well.
Thanks to Ulysses for sponsoring App Stories this week. With Ulysses, your writing is always right at your fingertips. The app, which won an Apple Design Award in 2016, is available on iPhone, iPad, and the Mac. Combined with iCloud Sync, that means your devices are always up to date and your writing projects are always readily available no matter where you are. Ulysses won that ADA for a reason. It does an incredible job of tucking away an enormous amount of power behind a clean, simple UI that lets you write without distraction, but get the tools you need when you need them and where you need them. Let's consider some examples. Ulysses scales remarkably well from short form to long form writing. With the ability to nest groups of documents in the app's library, apply filters, set writing goals, merge and glue writings together, and add notes, images, and keywords, Ulysses adapts to anyone's writing style. There's plenty more too. Your writing is just as easy to get out of Ulysses as it is to get in. Whether you want to export to plain text, Markdown, HTML, EPUB, PDF, or DocX, you've got several choices. Ulysses supports flexible styling and exported documents too, so your final product looks just the way you want. To learn even more about Ulysses, go to ulyssesapp.com, where you'll find tons of information about all of its features. Ulysses is available on the App Store and the Mac App Store as a 14-day free trial. After that, it's $4.99 per month or $39.99 per year. Or if you're a student, it's just $10.99 per year. But Ulysses has a special deal just for App Stories listeners. Use the link in the show notes, ulyssesapp.com/appstories, and you'll get to use the app for 3 months absolutely free. That's a great deal and a great way to get acquainted with all of Ulysses' features. Again, that's ulyssesapp.com/appstories for 3 months free. Thanks again to Ulysses for supporting App Stories.
So one of the points that I tried to make in my review of Alto's Odyssey is the idea of sort of almost using the Alto games as a therapy in a way, sort of like a game to unwind and to relax at the end of the day. Because I really think that both Alto's Adventure and especially Odyssey, they lend themselves well to just relaxing gameplay. That they are games that create tension, I think, but it's not that kind of stressful tension that doesn't make me relax. It's a strange experience to describe. I mean, I have Alto's Odyssey on my home screen because more than a game, it's almost like a tool in the sense that I want to open Alto's Odyssey at the end of the day because it's like listening to music. It makes me feel happy. Have you heard any other stories like this, or am I just the weird one here?
No, I mean, we've definitely had a lot of really heartwarming sort of reactions from players, particularly people going to the effort to write us very touching emails saying that game has helped them through some particularly difficult times, or anxiety attacks, or it's helped them connect with a child who maybe has learning difficulties or some other, something else that's making things difficult to connect. So that's been incredibly validating. And it was always something we consciously wanted to explore with the game, but certainly not, we never expected it to resonate so strongly with people. And I think that's ultimately what gave us the confidence to add Zen mode into the game, which I believe was sort of almost a year after the game had launched. We were like, let's let's listen to the people who are playing the game this way and try and facilitate that as best we can, and give something back to the people who've reached out to us, and make it even easier for them to sort of tune out certain aspects of the game that are sort of extraneous to this sort of meditative approach to playing the game. But yeah, I think from a design standpoint, like, we were very much inspired by other games in the genre, but it felt like a lot of them sort of almost deliberately threw everything at you at once in an attempt to kind of create the most exciting experience possible. And I think that's great. There's definitely an audience for that kind of stuff. But it was a fun design challenge to sort of look at those types of games and say, how would we do it differently? How would we kind of filter out the noise and the distractions and just boil it down to the core elements. So it's, to summarize, I mean, it was definitely a conscious thing, but certainly we never anticipated it would really resonate in the way that it has.
Mm-hmm. What's the role of sound and music in all of this?
I think it's a huge part. I think there's a lot that sound can do to sort of almost bridge the gap or fill the gaps in an otherwise minimalist sort of art style. I think if you can get away with doing very little visually if the audio is comparatively quite high fidelity. And I think the direction for the audio has always been to make it as real world as possible. We didn't want like video game sounds. We wanted them to feel like they were coming from a real space. And we were incredibly lucky to work with Todd Baker, our audio designer on the project, who's worked on games like Tearaway and Monument Valley 2. And he just had such a clear vision and passion for what he wanted to do with the game that it was kind of infectious. And we realized we could just totally trust in his process and sort of almost take a step back and watch as it all came together. And he did a fantastic job of sort of embracing that philosophy of sort of almost like trying to round out this as a real space that players can escape to. So I think if anyone is out there who has played the game but not played it with headphones, I think I would really encourage you to try it. It's easily my favorite part of the new game. Yeah, I think it definitely counts for a lot.
I want to switch gears just a little bit, and maybe this is a question that is best suited for Ryan in the first instance, which is, we've seen a lot of changes on the App Store in the last 6 months or so that are, I think, geared mainly towards games, especially things like pre-orders. We now have pre-orders, and anybody can use pre-orders, but I think that that's a concept and a mechanic that we see more in the game industry in other spheres other than Apple's App Store first, and now it's coming to the App Store. And also, around the holidays, we saw a real influx of indie games on the App Store. We saw classics like Flower and Fez, and newer games like Thumper and others that were highlighted by the App Store. Where do you think things are going with Apple with gaming? And I feel like on one level they're kind of recommitting themselves to gaming, but then I also am not always sure if they're truly committed to gaming, or maybe if it's not so much a commitment, but necessarily understand gaming.
I think I'm sort of in your camp as well. Like, I'm not 100% sure, but I definitely know that they take it quite seriously. And I think with the new App Store and games and apps being separated, that's sort of a clear indication of that. And I think what's really interesting is the fact that in the Today tab, they're actually telling, sort of the why and the how behind whether it's a game or an app, on how it's made, which is something that just didn't really happen before. And I think it's really cool to sort of have the human element shine through and for people to kind of understand what goes into making a game or an app. I think, the sort of premium indie games that you mentioned, I think they share some of the same design philosophies that Apple has, I believe. This is just my opinion. I don't really know, but I feel like they sort of also really highlight their devices and what makes them special. And what's so cool about the iPhone and the iPad, and also Apple TV, but more so the iOS devices, is that almost everyone around the world now has a smartphone in their pocket. And with that, you're able to reach like this much bigger audience of people that isn't necessarily or aren't necessarily traditionally into gaming. And I think doing that for Apple's platforms is sort of the easiest because you sort of know how people are going to experience what you've created. So I think as a whole, it's kind of the games I think we're seeing a lot of, even in the last 6 months, things like Gorogoa and Florence are sort of showing. I think they're things that people may not traditionally know to be games, or may not. A lot of people might not consider themselves people who play games, but if you show them something like Florence or Gorogoa and they sit down and spend time with it, they might actually sort of say, oh, you know what? Like, I really enjoyed this. I didn't realize that this could be a game. And I had that experience myself way back with Tiny Wings. And I think Apple is trying to do what they can to kind of promote this. Beyond that, though, I mean, I have no exact ideas.
So I tried to play the game on the Apple TV, and I know that it's obviously not your fault, but I don't think that playing with the Siri remote is the best experience out there. If only because it's, even tapping feels slower, and I plan to try with the controller, I guess. But my question would be, do you think there's probably like a lost opportunity here to take games on the big screen more seriously? And do you wish that Apple was doing more, and not necessarily like a redesigned Siri remote, which personally I would love, but more broadly speaking, like a more serious commitment, for example, to controllers on the Apple TV?
I sort of share a little bit of your thoughts, and I think if Apple were to make their own controller, let's say like a console style controller, I think it would go a long way. And I don't know if it would have to be sold as like an add-on or something that just everyone who buys an Apple TV would get. I think would be part of the charm, or it's part of the charm of the Siri remote, is that if you can sort of make something work on it, that everyone who has an Apple TV will have that control. I think it was last year with iOS, maybe it was iOS 11, or that same keynote, where they announced that you can actually force the requirement of a third-party controller for an Apple TV game. So that's kind of a step forward, but I think the amount of people that own, something like a Steel Series, I don't have the stats, but it's probably not that high of a percentage. So it's hard as a developer to design something for Apple's TV without making sure that it works with the Siri remote. Even though you technically can, I think it's definitely a limitation. And I think the Apple TV now, and especially going forward in the future, I'm sure, is going to be as powerful as a lot of the consoles out there. So it could be a missed opportunity if it's powerful enough to run something, like a game like Firewatch, but doesn't have the hardware to control it, then it might be a limitation. I just don't know how much of a priority it is for them to sort of go down that road.
I want to switch gears just a little bit and ask you, what's coming next from Snowman? I mean, I know you have a lot of projects in the hopper, and I know you can't talk about everything, but what can we expect to see next coming out of Snowman?
Sure. Yeah, I think one thing we've learned, not to sound like a politician here, but I think one thing we've learned over the last year or so is that it's really hard to figure out when a game is going to be ready. I think even more so than an app, which is kind of like I was saying earlier, just a little bit more of a logical process as you're working on it. So I don't have any release dates or any real order to announce in terms of what's next, but we're hard at work on Skate City and Where Cards Fall, and also on Distant. And I think you had sort of asked earlier how this sort of came to be, and I think much like we got into gaming in the first place, it was also sort of a little bit of an accident in terms of the way we've ended up starting to work on other projects. All starting out with Where Cards Fall, which is a long story, but essentially I met Sam through us each interviewing the same designer, which was Mark Jardine, the designer of Tweetbot, and connecting several years ago before we had announced Alto's Adventure at all. And at the time, Sam was working at Disney on Where's My Water. And, we just emailed back and forth, sharing our interviews of Mark Jardine together. And I said, hey, we haven't announced anything, and publicly it looks like we only make productivity apps, but we're actually working on a game called Alto's Adventure. And so Sam was sort of part of that process pretty early on in terms of giving us feedback. And at the time, he showed me a game that he was working on, which was called House of Cards, before there was ever a Netflix show. And it had started off as a student project for him. And it was something that he was working on the side at the time and hoping to have out soon. So, I mean, to me, I thought that game was launching way back then in 2013. And yeah, so Sam and I kind of kept in touch. And when Alto's Adventure launched, we all went to GDC and we hung out and we got along really well. And then later in the year, I just sort of had messaged him to find out what was going on. And at the time, he had moved from Disney to Giant Sparrow to work on What Remains of Edith Finch, another amazing game if anyone hasn't played it. And yeah, I just kind of asked him like what was up, what was new, just kind of catching up. And he had said that he was thinking about quitting his job and finding a publisher to work on Where Cards Fall so that he could focus on it full time. And he was just sort of expressing his frustrations of talking to different publishers, but no one quite understanding what he wanted to do. And you know, being a little bit of a sleazy salesperson to him or something like that. And so a sort of light bulb went off in my head and said, because I was always super interested in the project, I said, you know, I haven't talked to Jordan at all, but maybe there's a way that we can help you make this game. And that turned into a several month-long conversation, ending up with us sort of deciding to team up and work on the game together. And then a couple other projects followed suit after that in sort of a similar way.
That's a really cool story. I mean, I know I've seen some previews of that game, and it looks really great, and I'm really eager to see the finished product. I really want to thank you, Ryan and Harry, for joining us today. It's been a great conversation, and we've really enjoyed having you on App Stories. Thanks for coming along.
Thank you, guys.
Yeah, thank you so much for having us.
Thank you very much.
Well, that's it for this week, folks. Thanks again to our sponsor, Ulysses, for making this show possible. And thanks again to Ryan Cash and Harry Nesbitt for joining us to talk about Alto's Adventure and Alto's Odyssey. Until next week, you can find Federico and I writing at macstories.net and on Club Mac Stories. Federico is at Vitici on Twitter. That's VITICCI. And I'm at John Voorhees. That's JOHNVOORHWES. Talk to you next week, Federico.
Ciao, John.